From the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, this is Adipod. I'm your host, Emilio Garcia. All right, welcome back. Here we are at the Australian Taxpayers Alliance office, here with Brian Marlowe, the Executive Director. How are you?
G'day.
So let's get to this week's news, what we found relevant. We'll start with the calls for a zero blood alcohol limit for drivers in New South Wales. There was recently a really tragic event involving a drunk driver who ran over 4 kids. He was something over 3 times the legal limit for alcohol and driving, for drinking and driving. Mm-hmm. And this, for some reason, has fueled a call to say you now should be allowed to have absolutely no alcohol in your system whatsoever. So, do you want to get us started there?
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem. Is a lot of these knee-jerk reactions always seem to come from the health lobby, because for some reason health bureaucrats think that they need to have input on every single aspect of someone's life. Now, the issue is it's come off the back of a really bad tragedy. But that person had already broken the law, was 3 times over the limit. So whether it was a 0 blood alcohol limit or 0.5 or, 0.1.
Yes.
It's not going to help anything. He was already incredibly drunk.
Yes.
And the thing that's not being considered here is that below the current alcohol limit, the reason they have that is because below that, the alcohol in your system has no actual impairment on your body.
That's right.
It's a decent indication of impairment, which is the key thing. So, for instance, P-platers, for instance, can't have any alcohol in their system. But then what that means is there have been cases where a P-plater the night before has had some drinks, gone to sleep, woken up, and they're well below 0.5. They're 0.05. They're at 0.01.
Yeah, they haven't been drinking that day.
Yeah, but they're even below what the acceptable limit for fully licensed drivers is.
Yeah.
They're at a limit that we know cannot impair you, and they lose their license.
Yeah.
So it's just a stupid knee-jerk policy reaction, and it's like the family haven't even had a time to grieve and bury their children. Yet health bureaucrats think that this is the perfect opportunity to then say, well, that's it. Yeah. No alcohol ever.
No, it's a very opportunistic as well, because then anyone who says, well, I don't think that's the proper response is like, you don't care
that 4 children died?
Exactly. It's like, well, it's pretty disingenuous. Also, this isn't a number plucked out of thin air. It's well-based in research and academic research. We have research out of the University of Notre Dame. We have several groups in the United States for the reduction of the harm of alcohol and drugs saying this is a perfectly authentic and legitimate limit that works for most people. And for some, I just don't even really understand what exactly this is meant to address, as much as just awarding a little bit more power to.
It's just a knee-jerk reaction by nanny statists, right?
Yeah. One reason to regulate you.
Yeah, and they're using a very, very horrible thing as a reason for why we should do it, conveniently ignoring the fact that this person was going to break the law anyway, regardless of what the alcohol limit was going to be.
Yes, that's exactly right. And so we both oppose that because it's just not sensical. And perhaps you saw my interview on 7 News about this, or perhaps you didn't because they didn't use my footage. But needless to say,
when I find the CEO of deleting my interview.
Yeah, the entire interview. Yeah, no kidding. All right, well, let's move past this and towards an issue that just had our blood boiling on the day of. There's obviously a travel ban with China here in Australia because of fears from the coronavirus. And so the Minister for Tourism came out with a statement saying that he was hoping that the federal government would come out with some kind of subsidy package for the tourism industry, similar to the one we're seeing for those affected by bushfires. Because they said, such a significant part of our income comes from Chinese tourists that now they're not coming. We should get subsidized.
Yeah, so I mean, and this is what's ridiculous, right? So it's like, okay, there are areas in Australia that have been completely annihilated by bushfires. We've been putting out calls to set up special economic zones that reduce tax burdens and regulations in those areas to help them recover more quickly. And there are some government grants to help these affected areas recover.
Right.
So on the back of a virus, as well as some bushfire-related issues, the tourism industry's turned around and said, we need a handout because essentially we engaged in poor business practices that only focused on one group of people from one area of the globe coming here all the time forever. And now that's not happening, so give money.
Yeah.
And it's just really so you're going to turn around to a working class taxpayer and say, hey, I made poor business choices, so give me your money.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. Emily Dye, the policy director, and I were talking about this, which is a business generally has to diversify, because if you're too dependent on one market, one customer, anything, then you're vulnerable. And when you're vulnerable and something happens to that one market, that one customer, whatever, then your business is going to suffer. And so what they're saying is we failed to do our due diligence. There was this cash cow essentially coming from China and awarding us all the money that we could ever need.
Yes.
And then something happens and we're like, okay, well, our incompetence should be subsidized by the taxpayer. It's like, you don't get to do that.
Well, I actually think it drives home a wider point, though, which is that Australia is actually very reliant on exports from China. Right? I guess we export a lot of minerals and coal and other exports to China, but we also rely heavily on imports from that country. So cheap consumer items, random trinkets you can get on Wish, plastics, all that kind of stuff. Well, I think this should serve as a warning, which is, hey, sometimes things can happen in countries that shuts down their manufacturing for a while, and that has global ramifications if they're the only country you're relying on.
Exactly.
So, while I'm a big fan of trade, again, we as a country should be diversifying where our trade is and not just relying on the Southeast Asian region. That's
just due diligence, really.
Yes.
But yeah, so I agree with you, and hopefully they won't receive a single cent of taxpayer money. They'll have
so the problem is, I guarantee you they will, because bureaucrats and the bureaucrats are the unelected politicians now, right?
Oh, sure.
And they just rubber stamp things, and ministers are too scared to go to war with their departments now. Yeah. So they'll probably just let it happen. It might not be as much as they want, but they'll get something.
Yeah, well, obviously the poor people at the Shangri-La or the...
yeah, everyone knows the Shangri-La is, just a struggling small business.
Yeah, so, we don't want to affect them too much. All right, so we have some other news on the political front. Richard Di Natale is gone. Now, we're a nonpartisan group, so we can't say that we're thrilled to see him go at all.
Yeah, I mean, we don't really have any party affiliations, so I can't for the life of me say that I'm so glad to see a careerist prick get booted or resign, quote unquote.
Yeah, we would never say that we're absolutely just overjoyed.
No,
he is no longer part of our politics. We would never say such a thing.
I would never say something like that.
But he's been replaced, and I'm kind of new to the Australian political scene. So, do you know anything about his replacement?
Adam Bant.
Yeah.
Adam Bant. But this is the thing, though, right? So Richard Di Natale leaves, and I could never say that I'm elated to see that happen. I would never say that.
We wouldn't.
But unfortunately, he then gets replaced with a worse version of Richard Di Natale. So it's less moderate, more insufferable, further on the left than Di Natale, which I didn't think was really possible.
Yeah.
And more of just a generic sort of Twitter blue tick, woke.
Yeah. In terms of rhetoric, he's way more among the blue tick Twitter.
In order to cover up his pure Marxist bullshit.
Yeah, exactly.
So a part of me actually hopes that this is the kind of stuff that will actually put off a lot of Greens voters, because when you actually look at Greens voters, they're champagne socialists. They're wealthy inner city people. They have one of the highest median incomes of party affiliated voters. Sure. People always joke about Liberal voters being the Liberal Party being the party of upwardly mobile. Yeah. And in some respects that's true, but there's a lot of working class people that vote Liberal.
Sure.
Not many working class people vote for the Greens.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I used to live in Glebe, which is a stronghold for the Greens. And it's funny to see Greens voters, kind of lefties, progressives, all that. They kind of live as conservatives. They espouse all these, very kind of socialistic lefty policies. But then when it actually comes down to it, the way that they live, it's like, 2-parent household, 2 cars, lots of savings, donations to charity, going to church, all these things that they do. So that's not really relevant to Di Natale quitting, but it is curious to see.
I hope it's part. Sorry, I can't say that. I'm nonpartisan. I definitely don't hope this is part of a long-term decline of the Greens.
Oh, no. We would never say that.
We would never say that.
All right. Moving on. Jackie Lambie. Jackie Lambie put essentially is gonna propose a bill to end the flow of dark money, so-called, into political parties. She's saying that essentially the burden of transparency is too low. That this essentially opens up kind of like the avenue towards legal bribery. But this obviously has some kind of ramifications for freedom of association, what people should be able to do with their own money. So I kind of like Jackie Lambie. I think that she's very principled and she's voted in the ways that we liked before. But I'm not exactly sure what to make of this.
Yeah, the problem is it's like the way it sounds. It's like, we're going to stop dark money flowing to politics. It's like, okay, what do you consider dark money?
Right.
Is it a business group holding a function and fundraising because they want to, represent the interests of small businesses.
Yep.
And then a senator goes, okay, yeah, I'll come to this dinner, and chip into my campaign. And actually, I will try and push to reduce, regulations on X, Y, and Z. Is that bad? I don't think so.
It depends, right?
It depends. Like, it's on a scale. So it's one of these things where it's like, to quote Trump, it's like, sounds good, doesn't work. Jackie Lambie, I think her heart tends to be in the right place. She does tend to sort of fall on a very Labour rhetoric side of things because she's a working class person.
Yeah.
And, I think in her mind, she's going, I want to remove nefarious, dodgy operations that happen between politicians and private, quote unquote private interests, or corporate interests rather. But I'm always really skeptical of ham-fisted kind of crackdowns because it doesn't actually solve the issues. I remember in America when they're like, we're going to remove the money out of politics, which means that you yourself can't make a donation to politicians of more than X amount. Yeah. And I was like, okay, well then what Microsoft does is they just turn around to all their employees and they go, here's your wage. Yeah. By the way, all of you make donations collectively as part of a super PAC. Yeah. So it didn't solve anything, and it actually empowered corporations to just take money to give to people.
This
sounds
part
good,
of
doesn't work.
Of a larger legitimate grievance, though, that voters can have and that our democracy does have, which is having people with a lot of money just kind of throw buckets of money at a politician just to make sure that when the time comes that they want their support and voting on something beneficial to them, maybe they're kind of on the hook because they don't really want to turn the spigot off, right? And so I think that the grievance is legitimate, but the way of going about it...
The solution, I think, will just be ham-fisted and won't work. The key is more transparency, right? Yeah. Which is more obligations for candidates and politicians to have to report where their money came from and who.
Sure, but the issue here is that the burden is more on the donor now.
Yes.
Because now they have to disclose with a lower threshold.
Yes.
And a lot of people don't, if you're an apolitical person, you have a business and whatever, but you have a political opinion and, some interests.
Yes.
Now it's going to be public after.
And all the huge companies that make massive donations don't care already, and they already disclose it.
Exactly.
So all you're doing is you're discouraging smaller players who go, actually, I run
sporting goods company.
Yeah, I run a sporting goods company, and I distribute to 50 stores in Australia, and I'm of a decent size, and I need to, convince a sports minister not to completely, screw over this policy proposal. I'll start donating to their campaign. People like that also tend to go, but I don't want the community to know that I'm supporting one MP over the other. Big corporates like Westpac don't care. Oh, no. Because what they'll do is they'll give $100,000 to the Labor Party, $100,000 to the Liberal Party, see who wins, and then turn around and go, hey, remember when we gave you $100,000?
Yes.
Do X, Y, and Z.
Exactly.
So it doesn't solve those issues, and I get that Jackie Lambie's concerned about, corruption and corporatism and all those sorts of things.
Sure.
But she always tends to fall on the side of, so therefore the response is ham-fisted regulation.
Right. And You may have realized already we're not super into that here at the Australian Taxpayers Alliance.
I do like ham.
Ham's good.
Ham is good.
Yeah. Moving on to ScoMo. So ScoMo, he has been on a victory tour. He's really doing well. His poll numbers are up.
His polling is just going up and up and up.
He's really been killing it recently. Now
playing to the middle has really worked out for him, and trying to appease the left has really reaped the rewards, as we've seen.
So now what he's doing is he's actually seeking state approval to actually approve a royal commission into
the bushfires.
Now here's what I was kind of thinking, which is there's nothing that can be shown in this report that will not immediately be taken by the political left of Australia.
And be Scott Morrison's fault.
Yes, and used against him.
Yeah.
So what I hear ScoMo saying is, well, I'm going to give the side of politics that detests me and will never like me and will never treat me fairly, I'm going to give them a win, but luckily I alienate my own base.
Yeah, it's a win-win scenario if you're not the Liberal Party. It's one of these things, right? So it's like, okay, we're going to set up a royal commission. It's going to probably cost more than $100 million because most royal commissions cost a bomb.
Yeah.
It will then engage different departmental groups, and most of the people that work in those departments don't tend to be conservatives and don't tend to like the current government. They'll put together reports. Things will get leaked to the media, which we know is totally unbiased and never errs towards the left end of the political spectrum. And, bingo, bongo, everything will be fine. And it's just, it's like an example of just like lazy, weird sort of centrism, where you think by doing this, it's one of those things where I guarantee you what happened is campaign headquarters or Liberal Party headquarters sat down and they went, what are we going to do to try and manage this PR crisis? And someone said, hey, well, we've got some random research that says that people like royal commissions. Because what happened was a research company called up, 800 people and said, hi, when things go wrong, do you like investigations? And they went, yeah, of course, that makes sense. And then they went, so therefore people like royal commissions.
Yes, exactly.
Well, people actually don't, and I think they're actually getting sick of them. It's a token gesture, and it's only going to blow up in their faces.
Yes.
And it's a waste of taxpayer money. I guarantee you it's going to cost probably around $100 million of taxpayer funds.
Yeah. And
to tell us what we already know.
Yeah. It's unbelievable. Well, we already went a little bit longer, so I could talk about Scott Morrison's failings in the recent months for hours, but I think we're going to leave it there, and we're going to turn now to a discussion that I had with Brett Heffernan, who is the director of the Brewers Association here in Australia. So stick around for that. And Brian, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm here with Brett Heffernan. How are you?
Great, mate. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. For those who may not know who you are, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm the CEO of the Brewers Association of Australia. So my members are the major brewers across the country.
Sounds great. So we wanted to get you on because this is an issue that really affects taxpayers, Australian taxpayers, in a pretty significant way, in a pretty culturally significant way, let's say. The cost of beer here in Australia compared to any other place is outrageous. I'm originally from the United States, lived in Mexico for a little bit, and I can tell you I've never seen beer this expensive. Why is that?
Well, basically, the single biggest component in the price of an Australian-made beer is tax. Most people you speak to are shocked when they learn that 42% of the price of a typical carton of beer in Australia is tax. And the tax element eclipses all other inputs. So when we're talking about the ingredients, the cost of production, transport, logistics, even the retail overheads and profit margins, tax is the single biggest cost in the price of a beer.
That's incredible. So that's 42%, you said?
That's right. So if you're looking at a typical carton at $52, $21.84 of that has been taxed. And of course, as of this week, that goes up again.
Right. And I believe this would be the 72nd hike that's
The
taken place?
71st, 71st, that's
71st.
right. It was August of 1983 that the government, in its wisdom, decided that automatic increases regulated through the ATO would be the way to go. And the political history to that, of course, is way back in those days. For those
Mm.
of us who are old enough to remember, every budget announcement the headline was, beer up and a variety of other things up. So this was a way of taking that sort of sting out of the announcement and also giving government clear air in terms of its own budget messages. And you'd have to say that's been pretty successful as a ploy, because as we've just mentioned, we're talking 71 consecutive increases over that period, and most people simply aren't aware of it.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. And getting a beer with a mate here in Australia, that's pretty core to the way that
Absolutely.
Australians interact with each other. And you're
Yeah, look
saying
at
that every time that you go out and have a beer with a friend of yours, a significant chunk, not
mm,
half, but close to half, is going straight into the pocket of the government.
yeah, absolutely. And I suppose life doesn't get much better or much more basic than getting together with friends or relatives around a barbecue
Mm.
or after work or whatever the case may be, and just relaxing and unwinding with a beer. But quite sneakily, over that 35-year period, you've been getting hit hard and hit relentlessly over that period. And our proposition is that enough's enough.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm thinking here, let's say you go to a bar, to like a pretty, simple bar, TVs on the wall, uh, and you get a beer that would cost you anywhere between $6 and $7, let's say, correct?
Well, I think the average price these days is about between 7 and 8, but
Seven
depending
and
on
eight.
what it is you're going for, what your
Mm.
particular taste does, it can be as much as $15 a schooner.
Yikes. All right. Well, if we're not going into the high end and
Sure.
we're staying kind of like within $7 and $8, what do you think if you were king and you can kind of establish the proper amount of tax on a beer? How how would that price look? How much would it cost for you to go and get a schooner?
Well, it depends. There are many ways that you can cut up the tax pie in relation to the excise, the beer tax, and the GST that's applicable to that. One of the
Sure.
things that people don't realise is they're getting taxed on their tax, and that is that the beer tax or the excise is applied, and then the
Mm.
GST is applied to that tax. So you're actually
Oh,
getting hit twice. But in
wow.
terms of the actual pricing, that would vary from pub to pub, to be frank.
Sure.
And that's why we typically use stubbies and cartons as the prime example. 75% of
Gotcha.
all beer sales in Australia are via packaged beer, so you're talking stubbies and
Mm.
cartons and so on. So that's where people feel the hit the most. Look, we've already started this conversation with government in terms of
Mm.
saying it's too high, we're out of whack with the rest of the world, and
Right.
Australia's drinking culture has changed markedly over the last few decades. So
Sure.
the fact that this thing keeps ratcheting up and hitting people at a time when cost of living pressures are very, very pertinent, we
Mm.
think the time is right to have a serious look at this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I suppose people who are pro alcohol taxes
Mm.
would say alcohol isn't a very good for you, just for your health. If drunk in excess, it can cause people to be violent, and so having a very heavy tax on it can actually be beneficial for the greater of society because then it disincentivizes drinking.
Mm.
What is your response to that argument?
Well, the evidence doesn't support that. If you look at the comparison with the countries that we typically compare ourselves with, so
Mhm.
our tax rate at $2.26 per litre of alcohol compared to Germany, which is 13 cents, Spain 15 cents, the US 31 cents, Canada 35 cents, and even the Kiwis are about half of what we are. If you look at
Wow.
their drinking rates per capita and their levels of harmful drinking, we're basically on par. So,
Huh.
if the argument held, then those countries with significantly cheaper prices in their beer, or alcohol for that matter, would be off the charts as far as alcohol harms are concerned. And certainly, there's been a significant body of international research, including in Australia, that has looked at punitive measures as far as higher prices and restricting access and
Mm.
those sorts of issues. And across research was actually conducted across 30 OECD countries, including us, and it found that price has no impact on harmful drinking. all it does is penalise people who drink responsibly. And when it comes to Australia, 84% of Australian drinkers drink within recommended guidelines. So
Yeah.
we've seen a significant cultural shift in this country in terms of drinking habits, marked improvement in binge drinking rates compared to the rest of the world. And in those countries that have significantly cheaper prices for beer, for alcohol in general, we're basically on a par in binge drinking and problem drinking. So the argument that price is a deterrent just simply doesn't hold water.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I suppose one of the questions that would come up right after you say this, and I think people would say, okay, well, that makes sense. And Brett articulated his point very well. But I'm concerned that if we reduce the tax on alcoholic beverages now, let's say we bring it down to where the US is, maybe even a little bit, more subtly to where the Kiwis are, then all these people would become incredibly excited by the fact that there's all this cheap alcohol. And so they'd, just run to the bottle-o, get a bunch of alcohol, and, rates would go up and it would be kind of a disaster.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. And some of the things that we've looked at in talking to government about potential remedies here are not going to that extent. We're very conscious of that being the natural catch cry. So I think that anything that government would do in this space would be moderate. I think we'd be highly optimistic to be saying that we're going to be on an equal footing with the US and others.
Okay.
But I think at the end of the day, people just recognise it's overtaxed. It is way out of whack with the rest of the world. And ultimately, what we're looking for is a little bit of relief. We're not looking for wholesale cuts that would, potentially lead to those sorts of outcomes. And
Okay.
frankly, no government would seek to do that. We're just simply looking for a way to make life a little bit easier given the cost of living pressures that Australians are facing.
Sure. And so, what do you think if the government were to say, you know what, Brett, you're right, we're going to take your advice. What should the tax on beer be in Australia? What would you say?
We're not trying to be prescriptive with it. We're happy to have that conversation with government
Mm.
because, as I say, there are multiple ways that you can dice it up. One suggestion that has been floated, and we've floated it as just a conversation starter,
Mm.
is the first 1.15% of alcohol in beer is tax free. Now we could lift that. We could lift that to 1.5% for packaged beer, maybe 2% for draft beer, given that there are greater overheads and job opportunities in terms of pubs and clubs and so on. So there are many ways that you can dice it up, and even at that level, the modelling would indicate that the hit to the federal budget would be about 250 million, which sounds a lot, but in federal budgetary terms, it's really not. And in doing that, you would reduce, the cost of a slab by, between $1.50 and $2. And our argument is that at that level, you're not doing anything to promote people going out and stocking up. And ultimately, even if it is made cheaper, if that's the current rate, the idea that people are going to rush out and stock up just doesn't make sense. You continue to enjoy your beer when you have your beer at the rate that you currently drink it.
Yeah. Well, you won't hear any objections from me. I don't think I disagree with you on any of the points that you've made. So I think we're gonna bring this conversation to a close.
Correct.
So Brett, if you have any last points that you'd like to make.
Only that the basic proposition that we're putting is that a beer in Australia is fast getting beyond the reach of ordinary Australians, and we think there's something fundamentally wrong with that. We think the time is right to have a serious look at it, and we're happy to have that conversation with government over weeks and months ahead, and we will certainly have more to say in a public sense in the weeks and months ahead, so that people can have their say.
I agree with you, and you have our support 100%. We despise taxes in general, and we also like beer. So you
I
definitely
think
have
we all
100%
despise
of our
taxes in general. Yeah,
yeah,
indeed.
and like beer. So no, this is a political winner, I think. Brett, thank you so much for taking the time, and we'll talk to you soon.
Great. Thank you very much.